Hello, and today I will be reflecting about my English improvements and pieces of work this year. So, my overview of my writing experience. I had some punctuation errors at the beginning of the year, and throughout the whole year, I always had some punctuation errors, so that's definitely something I want to focus on and improve on, which are my punctuation errors and grammar. I also don't want to repeat myself as much because at the beginning of the year I always repeated myself in my writing. And I also want to use the correct tenses because at the beginning of the year I used the wrong tenses sometimes. So here's an early piece of my writing. We had to hand it in on the first week of school. It was a reflection on the book we read over the summer holidays. And here are three examples of me using wrong grammar and not having commas in the area. So here's our first example, as you can see in the circled area. And then here's our second example. There needs to be a comma there because you want to pause there when you're reading it. Some might think of summer reading as a chore. Others think it's fun. It's separating those two sentences, like miniature sentences, and it's also a break where you want to breathe when you're reading this. And finally, here's our third example of where I should have put a comma, but I used the wrong grammar at the beginning of the year. Moving on to my major writing piece, the AI. Here's an example where I repeated myself, as you can see in the highlighted area. Then here's an example where I had a punctuation error. I should have put a comma splice there. Here's an example of how I improved this writing thanks to the feedback. So as you can see above here, at the lower part I entered it and added a new paragraph because in stories it's better if you use smaller paragraphs. Here it was a mistake with my manners. I wrote, I and Kevin just slowly turned our heads and looked, but I should have written, Kevin and I just slowly turned our heads and looked. Here's another example where I repeated myself too much. As you can see in all the highlighted areas I wrote read, but I should have used synonyms or other verbs to express this and not always repeating the whole reading verb. Here's an example where I used the wrong tense, so I had to correct this. And finally, in these pieces I used some weak descriptions at the beginning of the year, so here are a few examples of weak descriptions. It felt like the world had ended or that we would just be put in jail. This was a weak description since the two don't really relate to each other and we were just children in this piece, so it wasn't really a good comparison. Here's another weak description. One looked furious, and right beside her was the principal. She has no facial expression like always, but I can see a slight disappointment in her face. This is also missing some grammar, since when I'm reading this it doesn't really make any sense. Should have had a comma in there. And here's my final example for a weak description. Here I should have just added a marker to show what this noise was made from so that it would make more sense for the reader. Moving on to my pastiche. In my pastiche here I used some unrealistic I wrote some unrealistic descriptions. For example, here that Marcelo would get a perfect score, since that wasn't really realistic, since he's not that person who gets perfect scores. Here's another thing, it doesn't seem realistic that Marcelo is like a top student now. Here's an example how I improved my writing in this pastiche. Before it was, as you can see in the comment of the teacher, I sprinted down, still in pajamas, right to the mailbox. I started ripping open the envelope that had my name written on it. As you can see here, I even had a little spelling mistake in open and I wrote over by accident. And now, going on to how I improved it, it's on the left side. I sprinted down the stairs, still in pajamas. At the second last step, my heart skips a beat. I stop dead and think about my nightmare again. I know it was just a dream, I told myself. But I have an urge that's about to explode. I need to know what I got. I walk to the mailbox, and as I open it, I see my 2 envelopes. As I take them out, I already started ripping open the envelope that had my name written on it. Here is another grammar example. As you can see on the right, the comment of the teacher, I wrote Namu with a small n, and it should have been capitalized since it's a name, meaning it's a noun. And moving on to my analytical writing. This was in the Romeo and Juliet newspaper that we had to write. On the left you can see how it started out with and the pretty horrible writing I wrote there, and on the right you can see how I improved this writing and how it's pretty good at the end. Mercutio sitting on bench alone, and then Tybalt walked to him and fight to death. Tybalt kill Mercutio. Very sad. There's wrong tenses in this small description. It's a not really detailed description, and there's also some grammar errors. On the right here, you can see how I improved this. It was not even meant to be a fight. On a sad sunny day, the 2 households walked in their groups, and they didn't see this one coming. As Mercutio jokes around with Tybalt, Tybalt requests to duel with Mercutio. It was a sad outcome, since no one should have died. The prince's own blood was spilled in a public duel between Mercutio and Tybalt. He was stabbed under the arm of Romeo. It was a devastating moment for whole Verona to find out Mercutio was stabbed. And then moving on to another example in the same newspaper. On the left you can see how it started out with, and on the right hand side you can see my improvements on this. Let's start with the left. Romeo was not said that Juliet was sleeping, so he killed himself, and Juliet wakes up and kills herself. This has wrong tenses, it doesn't make sense when you're reading it out loud. Well, it's also really undescriptive. It's not as good as it could be. On the right hand side are my improvements. The beloved Juliet and her Romeo both took their lives last Tuesday. It was an unfortunate mistake, since she was actually only in a deep sleep and he thought she was dead. We have since been told that she stabs herself with his dagger so she can live in heaven with Romeo. On the right hand side you can clearly see it's better writing for a newspaper. And yes, moving on to my goals. My first goal is to improve my grammar. When I improve my mechanics, I also enriched my grammar. But I still need to work on my grammar. That's why I do grammar exercises on vocabulary.com. My second goal is that I don't want to repeat myself as often. And if I organize my writing before I start it, it makes me avoid the repetition. And also, since I practice on vocabulary.com, I can learn new words and I can use synonyms to avoid the repetition when I'm writing something. And my conclusion. My overall experience in English this year, it was different than the other classes, since in the other classes after we had a quote unquote test, we got back our grade and didn't really look at what we did wrong. But in English this year, we always got feedback before we handed something in. I really appreciated the observations since I was able to improve my writing a lot with this. And I improved my grammar significantly, and I also mostly use the correct tenses now when I'm writing something. Thank you for listening.